My husband called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was having coffee with my sister at her place in Oakville. I remember the exact moment. She had just poured the second cup and I was laughing about something completely unimportant when his name lit up my screen. I almost didn't answer. "I want a divorce," he said. No hello. No hesitation. "And I've already spoken to a lawyer about the house. You should know I'm keeping it. Natalie and I need the space." I set my coffee down very slowly. My sister watched my face. I kept my voice even. "Okay," I said. "That's it? Okay?" He almost sounded disappointed. He wanted a fight. He wanted me to cry or beg or shatter so he could feel justified in everything he'd already done. I could hear the confidence in his voice, that particular tone he used when he thought he was holding all the cards. "That's it," I said. "I'll talk to you when I get home." He hung up. My sister reached across the table and grabbed my hand. I looked at her and I said, calmly, with a steadiness that surprised even me, "He has no idea what's in that house." What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd spent the last 11 years underestimating me, was that I had been quietly preparing for this exact phone call for 8 months. Let me go back to where this actually started. My husband and I had built something real together. Or at least I thought we had. We met in our late 20s when he was a mid-level project manager at a development firm in Hamilton and I was a junior architect just starting to build my reputation. Over the years, as my practice grew, so did our life. We bought our home in Burlington, a beautiful old Victorian I'd personally renovated, and I poured everything into making it ours. The mortgage was in both our names. The equity was substantial. The market had been generous to us, and by the time everything fell apart, that house was worth just over $1.4 million. My practice had grown steadily. I had a small firm, 4 employees, and a solid client base in the commercial renovation space. My husband had eventually left his firm and gone independent, doing residential development. He was charming, good with clients, excellent at selling a vision. He was less excellent at following through on the financial details. So over time those responsibilities had quietly migrated to me. I tracked the accounts. I managed the invoicing. I filed our taxes. I knew where every dollar went. The first time I noticed something wrong was in the fall of the previous year. A transfer I didn't recognize. Small enough that most people would have dismissed it. $800 moved to an account I didn't have access to. I sat with it for a day. Then I started looking more carefully. What I found over the following weeks was not a single mistake. It was a pattern. Money leaving our joint account in amounts designed to look like business expenses. Transfers to what I discovered was a joint account he shared with Natalie, a woman who worked in his development circle. Receipts I couldn't verify. A hotel stay in Niagara-on-the-Lake charged to our shared credit card over a weekend he had told me he was at a job site in Brantford. I didn't say a word to him. Not one word. Instead, I made an appointment with a family law lawyer on my own, someone with no connection to anyone we knew, a woman out of a small firm in Mississauga who came highly recommended from a colleague. What she told me changed how I thought about everything that came next. In Ontario, she explained, divorce is governed by the Divorce Act and the Family Law Act. Marital property is subject to equalization of net family property, meaning we'd each calculate what we brought into the marriage and what we had now, and the difference is split. The house, the practice, the RRSPs, the TFSAs, the vehicles, all of it goes on the table. What mattered was documentation. What mattered was being organized before the other person realized the game had started. She also told me something I hadn't considered. If my husband had been using marital funds for an undisclosed relationship, paying for hotels, covering personal expenses of a third party, using joint accounts that could be characterized as a dissipation of family assets, it wouldn't change the equalization formula itself, but it was absolutely relevant to the court's perception of his financial disclosure. And if his financial disclosure turned out to be incomplete or misleading, we were looking at a very different kind of proceeding. I went home that evening and made dinner, and listened to my husband talk about a project he was pitching, and I smiled in the right places. He had no idea that I had already begun building the case. Over the next 8 months, I documented everything. I printed bank statements and had them notarized. I kept a log of dates, transfers, and amounts. I gathered receipts. My lawyer filed a request for financial disclosure that was strategically timed. Not yet, she said, not until we're ready. I transferred my personal savings, The money I'd earned before our marriage and kept in a separate TFSA in my name alone, into an account he had no access to, which was entirely legal and which my lawyer confirmed I was well within my rights to do. I made sure my practice's financial records were airtight. I had our accountant prepare a proper valuation. I said nothing. The reason I waited, and I want to be clear about this because I know it's the question anyone listening would ask, is because timing matters more than reaction. If I had confronted him the moment I found that first transfer, he would have had months to hide assets, to restructure accounts, to move money in ways that would have been difficult and expensive to trace. Family court proceedings in Ontario can take years. The person who controls the paper trail in the beginning has a significant advantage throughout. I was not going to give that advantage to him. When he called me from wherever he was sitting with Natalie and told me he was keeping our house, he had already filed nothing. He had spoken to no one with any real authority. He had told a woman who had spent 8 months preparing that she should pack her things and be grateful for whatever he chose to leave her. He thought he was ending my chapter. He had actually just given me permission to start writing his. I drove home from my sister's that evening in a way I can only describe as calm. Not the brittle calm of someone holding themselves together, but the real kind, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're walking into. He was in the kitchen when I arrived, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, Natalie nowhere to be seen. He had the look of someone who had rehearsed the conversation. "We need to talk about the logistics," he said. I set my bag down on the kitchen island. "I agree. I've already spoken to Robert." Robert was a family lawyer he'd apparently consulted that day. He says given the structure of your practice and the fact that the house was purchased jointly, I'm entitled to a significant share of both. He's right that it's a joint asset, I said. He may not have mentioned the part where joint assets require joint disclosure. He frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means that before any asset division can proceed, both parties have to provide full financial disclosure. I kept my voice level, almost conversational. Full disclosure of all accounts, all income, all transfers made in the last 3 years. The silence that followed was brief but specific, the kind of silence that happens when someone does a rapid internal calculation. "That's standard," he said finally. Yes, I agreed. "It is." I walked upstairs and I let him sit with that. I heard him on the phone 40 minutes later, his voice lower than usual. Words I couldn't make out but a tone I recognized, the nervous energy he always tried to disguise as decisiveness. He was recalibrating. He didn't recalibrate fast enough. My lawyer filed the formal separation paperwork the following morning. With it came a request for full financial disclosure and a preservation order, a legal mechanism that prevents either party from disposing of marital assets during proceedings. That order covered the house, the joint accounts, and any business interests he had accumulated during the marriage. By the time he arrived at his lawyer's office that afternoon, our jointly held assets were frozen. His lawyer called mine that same afternoon. I was told about it after the fact, sitting in my lawyer's office over tea while she summarized the conversation with the kind of professional understatement that told me he'd had a very bad morning. "Robert apparently advised your husband that the timeline he had in mind wasn't quite as straightforward as originally discussed," she said, choosing her words precisely. "There were some questions raised about certain transactions." "There would be," I said. She looked at me over her reading glasses. "You've kept very thorough records." "I'm an architect," I said. "I work in details." The financial disclosure process is where everything began to unravel for him. Under Ontario law, each spouse has to fill out a Form 13, a financial statement that itemizes every asset, every liability, every income source, and every significant transfer made in the preceding 3 years. It has to be sworn under oath. Lying on a Form 13 isn't a strategic miscalculation. It's perjury. His initial submission came back incomplete. My lawyer identified 11 discrepancies between what he had declared and what I had documented over the preceding 8 months. The transfers to the undisclosed account, the hotel stays, a vehicle he had purchased in his name alone using funds from a joint line of credit and then failed to list, 3 invoices paid from his business account to a company that, when I had my accountant look into it, turned out to be a numbered corporation registered to Natalie's brother. My lawyer compiled everything into a single, very organized package and submitted it to the court. She also wrote to his lawyer directly. The letter was, by her own description, clear. I never saw Natalie again after that. I don't know what she and my husband discussed when the scope of the financial disclosure became apparent. I don't know what conversations happened between the two of them as the numbered corporation became a point of legal interest and her brother's name appeared in correspondence. What I do know is that the certainty he'd had on the phone that Tuesday afternoon, that particular quality in his voice that told me he'd already decided how this story ended, was entirely gone the next time I saw him. In a professional context. That meeting happened in a boardroom at my lawyer's office. About 6 weeks after the separation papers were filed, he came in with Robert and 2 printed copies of a revised financial statement. He didn't look at me when he sat down. My sister had asked me, the night before, whether I was nervous. I told her the truth. I wasn't nervous about what was going to happen. I was only thoughtful about how long it had taken to arrive here. 11 years. The late nights I spent building my practice while he charmed clients over dinner and called it a partnership. The renovation work I'd done on that house with my own design plans, my own contractor relationships, my own vision work that had added hundreds of thousands of dollars to its value. The tax returns I'd filed carefully year after year, the RRSPs I'd contributed to methodically, the TFSA I'd managed while he cashed his out twice for what he called investment opportunities that went nowhere. He thought he had walked out on a marriage. He hadn't realized he was walking away from the only financial infrastructure he'd had for over a decade. The revised disclosure was more complete. Still not entirely accurate, my lawyer flagged 2 remaining issues, but significantly more complete. And with that completeness came a picture of his actual financial position that was notably less impressive than the one he'd presented in our kitchen 8 weeks earlier. His independent business, stripped of the joint line of credit he could no longer access and the client relationships that had, it turned out, been initiated through my professional network, was carrying more liability than asset. The development project he'd been pitching when all of this began had fallen through. 2 of the investors had withdrawn when they'd done their due diligence and found the numbered corporation in the documents. His name was connected to a financial structure that raised questions he didn't have good answers to. Robert put a settlement offer on the table. I read it carefully. Then I set it down. He wants to keep the house, I said. With a buyout, Robert clarified. A fair market buyout of your share of the equity. Based on whose appraisal? There was a brief pause. We'd commission an independent appraisal. My lawyer had prepared me for this. The house, appraised by a firm we'd engaged 2 months earlier, came in at $1.42 million. The mortgage balance was just over $300,000. The net equity was just over $1.1 million. My equalization share after accounting for what each of us had brought into the marriage and the asset values on both sides was substantial. But a buyout only works if the person buying you out can actually finance it. Walk me through the financing, my lawyer said. Robert cleared his throat. The answer, as it emerged over the next 15 minutes, was that the financing was not in place. The bank he'd approached had declined based on his current debt load and the question marks around his business's financial history. He was proposing a structured buyout with payments over 18 months, payments contingent on income that was, at the moment, uncertain. I looked at him across the table. He was staring at the page in front of him. I thought about the Tuesday afternoon. The confidence. Natalie and I need the space. I'll be purchasing his share, I said. Robert looked up. Even my lawyer glanced over briefly, though she recovered quickly. I'd been working on this part for 3 months. The practice valuation had come back strong. I had a pre-approval from my bank, a straightforward one, based on my documented income and credit history, which was excellent because I had personally managed our finances for a decade and never missed a payment on anything. The buyout number I put on the table was fair. It was exactly what the equalization calculation produced, down to the dollar, based on our respective financial statements. His lawyer reviewed it. They asked for 24 hours. We gave them 48. He accepted. The house transfer was completed 6 weeks later. I stood in the front hallway after the last of the paperwork was signed, in a home I had renovated room by room, that I had chosen and envisioned and built into something worth more than either of us had paid for it, and I let myself feel the weight of the previous 8 months lift. Not triumph. Not anger. Something quieter than both of those, the feeling of having done something very difficult with precision and patience, and having come out the other side still standing. My sister came over that evening with a bottle of Ontario wine and we sat on the porch I'd designed myself, and she asked me when I'd known the very first time that things were going to go the way they went. I told her about the $800 transfer. How I'd stared at it for a full day before deciding that a number that small, hidden in plain sight, was either a mistake or the beginning of a pattern. How I'd chosen to behave as though it was the beginning of a pattern, and how that choice made quietly, months before any phone call or confrontation, had changed everything that came after. She asked if I was sad. I thought about that seriously before I answered. I'm sad about what I thought we were, I said. Not about what actually happened. There's a difference between those two things, and it took me a long time to understand it. The marriage I was grieving had existed mostly in my own understanding of it. The actual marriage, the one in the bank records, the hotel receipts, the numbered corporation, had been something else entirely for a long time. You can't properly mourn the loss of something that was already gone. The practice continued. I brought on a fifth employee in the spring, a young woman fresh out of a program at Ryerson who reminded me a little of myself at that age, meticulous, slightly underestimated, very good at holding a great deal of information quietly in her head. My commercial renovation work had opened into some institutional contracts. There was a project with a municipality in the Niagara region that would carry us for 2 years. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected message from a former client, a woman who had gone through her own difficult separation the year before and had, through someone in her network, I heard something about mine. She asked if I'd be willing to have coffee and talk about how I'd navigated the financial disclosure process. She'd heard I'd kept thorough records, and she had a friend who was beginning to realize she needed to do the same. I agreed to meet her. We talked for 2 hours. She took notes. Her friend, I learned later, retained a lawyer the following week and began documenting what she found. I'm not in the business of advice. I'm an architect. I design structures that hold weight without failing. But I've come to understand that the same principle applies further than buildings. You don't build something to protect against a collapse you've already experienced. You build it before the collapse comes, when everything still looks stable, when no one is watching the foundation for cracks. My husband built his exit strategy on the assumption that I hadn't been paying attention. He wasn't the first person to make that mistake with someone they'd spent years underestimating. He won't be the last. But he was the last one who would make it with me. I still have the Victorian. I repainted the front door this spring, a deep navy, something I'd wanted to do for years and that he'd always vetoed in favor of something more neutral. The neighbors mentioned it the first week. 2 of them said it was the best thing that had happened to the street in years. The morning after the door dried, I stood on the porch with my coffee and looked at it for a long time. 11 years is not nothing. There is grief in it, real grief, and I don't minimize that. But there is also something on the other side of grief that doesn't have a clean name, not happiness exactly, not relief exactly, something more like clarity. The feeling of seeing your own life in accurate focus for the first time in a long while. He thought he was closing the door on something. I was painting it a color I'd chosen entirely for myself. He had no idea the whole house had always been mine.